Okay, so welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for Zoryan Institute's Academic Writing Workshop with Professor Henry Theriault and Professor Alex Alvarez. My name is Megan Reed and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I'll ask that you please submit your questions to the host in the Q&A chat function. We will be addressing these questions during the question and answer period at the end of this workshop. I'll also kindly ask that you avoid submitting any specific questions regarding your own work, as we want this Q&A to benefit the entire group. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Zoryan Institute is a nonprofit organization that produces scholarship and raises awareness on issues related to universal human rights, genocide, and diaspora homeland relations. In addition to hosting international conferences, a graduate level summer program with the University of Toronto, publishing books, and conducting original research, the Zoryan Institute publishes 2 academic journals in partnership with the University of Toronto Press: Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, and Genocide Studies International. The establishment of the Diaspora Journal in 1991 was a seminal moment in the field of diaspora studies. This publication captures the current state of a world where borders are elastic, boundaries fractured, and identities are fluid. It's published twice a year online and in print, and more information about this journal will be shared in the chat box with you. Genocide Studies International, often referred to as GSI, was originally titled Genocide Studies and Prevention and was founded in 2005. This journal raises knowledge and awareness among scholars, policymakers, and civil society actors by providing a forum for the critical analysis of genocide, human rights, crimes against humanity, and related mass atrocities. We are very lucky to have co-editors of GSI as our hosts for today's workshop, Professor Henry Theriault and Professor Alex Alvarez, who both have years of experience in editing, selecting, and publishing papers for academic journals. Professor Henry Theriault is professor and chair of the philosophy department at Worcester State University. Theriault's research focuses on reparations, victim-perpetrator relations, genocide denial, genocide prevention, and mass violence against women and girls. He has published numerous journal articles and chapters in the area of genocide studies, and he has over a decade of experience working with academic journals in different capacities. He's the founding co-editor of Genocide Studies International and was more recently named co-editor of Transaction Publishers Genocide, a critical bibliographic review. He previously served as co-editor of Genocide Studies and Prevention and was guest editor of the International Criminal Law Review's special issue on Armenian genocide reparations and the Armenian Review special issue on New Global Reparations Movement. Professor Alex Alvarez is professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. His main areas of studies are in collective and interpersonal violence. His most recent book, Unstable Ground: Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide, was published in July 2017. He has extensive experience working with academic journals, as he served as an editor for the journal Violence and Victims and was a founding co-editor of the journal Genocide Studies and Prevention, now known as Genocide Studies International. He has also served as an editorial board member for a number of journals as well. Professor Theriault and Professor Alvarez, we're so excited to see what you have in store for us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you for all your work for Zoryan Institute and the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. It's been great to work with you over these past years, and we're excited for all the work you did to pull this together, and your team as well. You know, just great to work with, and we appreciate all the work. I just wanted to give I did want to say my bio may be a little out of date, but I can send a corrected one. There's things I'm getting credit for that are no longer true, but that's okay. I wanted to open just by letting you know maybe a little bit of why we wanted to do this program. Alex and I both have been editing for I would say between us many years, and starting earlier in our careers, and now that I think we're now senior scholars, is that true? I feel like it. I don't know. We want to say mid-career, but probably senior now. And so we have been active editing, through different phases of our own careers, and we have really worked a lot to help develop emerging scholars. That's been a big focus of ours, I think, over the years. We've always sought very innovative work for Genocide Studies International, and at different times we both co-edited Genocide Studies and Prevention, and in the other editorial work we do. And so we really see the role of being an editor as being supportive of people who are entering the field, who are developing in the field, and so forth. And so in thinking about our experiences, particularly in recent years, where we, in all honesty, we've seen a lot of great potential in submissions we've received, in discussions we've had with people, and so forth. But there are at times things that come up that prevent people, potential authors, from realizing that potential. And some of it is very, very, I almost want to say mechanical or logistical almost. There are things that can easily be addressed. And then some of them are just things to think about as people are doing research. So we're hoping to share today some ideas that will help scholars who are interested in publishing in our journal in particular, but also much more broadly in academia. We follow very similar patterns for other journals, certainly UTP, University of Toronto Press journals. We're very consistent with their approach, but even more generally. And even I would say, although our articles tend to be in humanities and social sciences, broadly construed, I know we have at least one person from the field of biology. We have, I'm sure, other folks from other science fields. We certainly are open to public health. All these fields are certainly open for GSI publication, and we will find peer reviewers who are qualified to review for those. And I would say that a lot of the tips we'll have today will be applicable broadly across different academic disciplines, although just bear in mind that some of them are going to be more specific to social science and humanities publishing. Alex, I'll turn it over to you to add your thoughts here.
Thanks, Henry. Thank you, Megan. So welcome, everyone. As Henry pointed out, we thought that this workshop would be something we could provide in the spirit of helping foster success among many of you out there. As editors, but also as authors, we have a bit of experience. And yeah, we have seen a fair number of submissions that had to be rejected because of issues and problems that could have easily been avoided with some more work. Good ideas, but that were not able to be seen through to fruition. And so we thought we would have this kind of informal little workshop where we'll present some tips and strategies to help explain the process, to avoid some common pitfalls, and maybe some ideas to help you maximize your chances of successfully finding a home for your research. Hopefully you'll get some use out of this. I mean, some of the ideas we suggest might seem pretty straightforward, or it might be information that is already something but hopefully others will be useful in terms of you thinking about your work and being able to take a good idea and carry it all the way through to successfully having it published. And so in this informal thing, Henry and I are just going to take turns and kind of, share some ideas. We have some outlines, but essentially we're going to present some material and then we'll have some time to answer some of your questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Henry.
Great. And we're going to actually just touch on things that need to be done before submission, and then the process that happens after submission, after acceptance or request for revision and so forth. And then maybe some concluding remarks as well, some general remarks. One of the things to keep in mind is that the work prior to submission is really the crucial phase. If you lay the groundwork for the project you're doing well and you follow it through well, you're going to be in a good position. We can, a revisions process can handle fine-tuning how very good research is presented. it can't redo the research. So the important thing is whether you're in humanities and your research consists of looking at the kinds of literature that's out there and being aware of it and so forth. It's really important to do that work, whether it's doing, constructing a survey instrument appropriately. And this is probably the biggest challenge for us, is where we see people, as Alex said, we see people with great ideas, and then the way that they actually do the research based on them really doesn't allow the idea to be publishable by academic standards. And that becomes the problem, where the research project itself would have to be redone for a publishable product to come out of it. So you want to be really thoughtful about what you're doing for your research. We have noticed, and this may be more of a trend, because there are so many journals out there and so much online, even beyond sort of, I'll say, quasi-academic work online, that it's harder to gauge what good research standards are. Those who are in graduate school and have good guidance, good mentoring, will have that background. But for a lot of folks, even there isn't the support you need. And so you really want to make an effort to really look at the best work in your field. Know what's there. And in addition to that, there are more practical things, and I'll jump into that. The first thing is also know the journal you're submitting to. Okay, know what the guidelines are, what the formatting requirements are, what all those kinds of nuts and bolts things, as well as what kinds of articles are typically published. Are they more conceptual, more data driven? Those kinds of things. And when you get a sense of that, you'll get a better sense of what journal will be the right fit for you. We try to be very eclectic at Genocide Studies International, but you want to be reading issues, so you get a sense of the kinds of things that qualify as really good scholarship. So let me turn it over. Should I turn it over to Alex?
No,
yeah, please.
So that's good. So number one, do your research, right? Know what the journal wants. Every journal has guides in terms of whether or not they want a cover letter, the formatting, the length. You'd be amazed at how often articles get rejected because they are over the length that the journal is willing to publish. Images, charts, maps, all these different kind of things. Make sure that you're familiar with those guidelines, those requirements, and follow them. And as Henry also said, make sure your article is a good fit for the journal. And so read previous editions of the journal, articles from it, to get a feel for whether or not this might be a good home for the work that you're doing. I would discourage you from contacting the editors with an idea for an article. Rather, it's not our place to say whether or not it's a good idea. You should, if you think it's a good idea and you want to do research in an area, write the article. Don't contact the editors with questions that can be found on the journal websites. Generally speaking, most journals have good websites with lots of information, lots of FAQ kind of stuff. Get familiar with it rather than just sending an email for the editor that they have to respond to. And then get a feel for the articles. Writing a journal article is not the same thing as writing a book chapter or a book. It tends to be a bit more constrained. And what I mean by that is that every journal kind of has a style in terms of the structure and organization of the article. And so, get a feel for what that is. The more your piece, your submission aligns with the general feel or style or structure that the journal publishes, the better your chances that it's going to get a favorable review. In other words, if it just is something that just reads very differently and has a different kind of organization, it's not quite as smooth a process. So let me just put it that way. Henry?
Unmute myself here. Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent, really excellent point, or set of points, Alex. I would add that as you're writing, don't write to a journal, write to your project, but then decide what journal is appropriate. I think that's the message we want to give. There are so many journals out there. You can find something. I think what's different, the difference between something like GSI and some of the journals that are now sort of multiplying is we're a very credible print-based journal with a high-level university publishing house and so forth. So there's an advantage, obviously, to going to a journal like ours. However, if your research doesn't fit here, look for where it fits. We don't want to, we love to get submissions from folks, but we don't want to force you to change what you're doing in order to fit something that's our vision and that doesn't connect well. Little technical things, and I want to go back to all the things about, don't make sure you've just followed all the guidelines, because if something goes wrong, it's a signal to us, and we don't mean to think this way, but if you haven't, if we are asking for a submission in a certain format and we don't get it that way, it sends us a message that the author is not really serious about our journal, because if they were willing to just take the little bit of time that it requires to make sure everything is done the right way, that would be the right signal for us. We don't mean to, because that may not be true, but it's just almost a default assumption we would make. Similar kind of thing, don't submit the same article to multiple journals simultaneously. And make sure you give a little bit of time for the process to happen, because it doesn't happen overnight. There are peer reviews and so forth. This comes up now sometimes. It really didn't. It was really an assumption, say 15 or 20 years ago. You did not do multiple journal submissions of the same article. It's come up a little bit more now. And the thing to remember with that is the field of, say, if you're looking at genocide studies, the field is fairly small, and it's very possible that someone we would ask as a peer reviewer actually has an involvement with another journal or something like that. And we do talk to each other. We do know what people are publishing. We ask opinions. And this has come up where we've had, with another journal in the field, I had a simultaneous submission. I only found out after we had sent it out to peer review, which was a huge problem. The other journal had also sent it out to peer review. Peer review is like, or peer reviewers are like the most precious object in the universe for us, or subject in the universe. I guess they're people. They are incredibly valuable, and their time is absolutely precious. And whenever we waste a peer reviewer's time with something that's not going to go into the journal or doesn't have the chance of going in, it's really hard. We end up, you can lose a peer reviewer that way, and so forth. Peer reviewers often have a stake in what they're reviewing, and they really want to, they want to support the process. They're volunteers. They want to support the process. So we want to be respectful of them, and that multiple journal submission issue is really a big sign of disrespect. To go a little bit further, along the same lines, when we get an article or a submission, Alex and I first review it ourselves to make sure it's appropriate for peer review. Not only do we need to make sure it's on a topic relevant to the journal's very broad mission, but we want to check to see if the basics of the article are there. If there's a literature review that's crucial, it needs to be done well. It needs to be up to date. It needs to be comprehensive. And we would add, even if the literature review isn't a big part of what you're doing, you need to know the literature. You need to make sure, this is a huge issue. You need to make sure you're not just saying the same thing that someone in the field said 30 years ago. We had some pretty brilliant people going back a few decades, and they pioneered some tremendous insights. If you don't know that literature, and it happens somewhat frequently that somebody will have an idea and it was done in 1982 or something. And so make sure you know, at least relevant to the topic you're writing on, what's come before. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do what you want to do, and doesn't mean your topic isn't good. It means you need to be able to explain what you're doing that's new. And that means, you know, working outside your discipline. For a field like genocide studies and you know, similar kinds of interdisciplinary fields or multidisciplinary fields, you know, it's not just enough to know if you're a historian. You need to know a little bit more than what historians are saying about a particular issue. Maybe you're looking at the evolution of human rights law pre-Nuremberg. You're going to need to read international lawyers. You're probably going to need to read, you know, political theorists and others who are looking at that issue, not just historians. And it can be a trap to fall into. Next, more on that research framework side. Do you have a theoretical framework for what you're doing? That is there a way that you're conceiving your project that fits it into the literature, fits it into the discipline in a way that's going to make sense to folks, and also in a way that's going to be able to inform your research in a really rich way? Is the methodology appropriate for your project? Okay, and this is really important. We mentioned this earlier. This is a case where, you know, or we've had cases where we've seen these great ideas, and then we start looking at the sort of methodology that was used, and it's really shaky, or it's incomplete, or it's just the wrong, you know, the wrong kind of approach to a given kind of topic. And that's really important. You know, asking that question is really important right up front, as we talked about before. Make sure that you have an analysis section. Sometimes we get articles with wonderful, I will say, information, data, you know, literature reviews and so forth. And we can tell the author is going somewhere, but the article itself doesn't get there. So really focus on whatever else you're pulling in, whatever data you're pulling in, whatever, you know, you're building on. Make sure your voice in a crisp analysis section is there. What is it you're really showing other people who are reading this article? Why should they read this article? You know, and if, you know, with conclusions and things like that, also really make the case for your article, really explain to people what's important in what you're doing. Just descriptive papers, which can be interesting in a certain way, are not enough for us. Our mission is to promote innovative, new scholarship, and so we need to see some of that. And it's especially great when we get articles that are developing a new framework for analysis. That I think is something we really welcome. New ways of approaching research, quantitative and qualitative. So keep that in mind. Don't think you have to conform to what's already been done. You can be very innovative, but just make sure all that stuff is there. Let me turn it over to Alex again.
Okay,
Yeah.
Great stuff, Henry. You know, I cannot emphasize enough what you were just saying. You know, I can think of a number of articles that were rejected fairly recently because, for example, the methodology that was used was just absolutely not appropriate for what they were trying to accomplish. Or that they did a study, it was an interesting study, they describe the process of it, but then they left it. There was no analysis, no conclusions, and you're left wondering, okay, so what? What are we supposed to make of this? So make sure that it is comprehensive, that your article has all of the required components. And if, you know, the literature, one of the difficulties in genocide studies in this field is that it is very interdisciplinary, that, you know, you are often reading outside of your training, of your disciplinary silo, but you need to make sure that you've done your homework, that the work you're doing builds upon, gives credit where it's due to the work of other people who've done earlier work in this area. In addition to that component, I would also add, make sure that your article is clean and polished. You would be amazed at how often we see submissions where there are typos, grammatical mistakes, real basic kind of problems. And it's hard not, once you're reading those, to not react to that, right? You want to present the most polished piece of writing that you can, because it tells us, the editors, as well as reviewers, that you've taken the time to craft this, that you have worked to refine your ideas and your writing, and that you're presenting it as cleanly as possible. Think about, for those of you who teach, when you get submissions from your students who, you know, threw something together and there are typos everywhere and all kinds of problems, and, you know, it's hard to be completely objective then when you read those. One of the things you can do that we would strongly encourage is have others review your work. In other words, if you have friends or colleagues who are willing to swap time with you where you can read each other's work and help edit, those things are wonderful because they can help clear up any writing issues. They can make sure it is ready for peer review. Because when the blind reviews take place, they're looking to find flaws, and you don't want to give them the flaws. You want to make sure that their focus as a reviewer or as the editors, that their focus is on the ideas, on the research itself, on the contribution that your work is providing for the field. In line with that, you know, one of the things that we also recommend that often seem to be helpful for people is, you know, there are peer writing groups, there are shut up and write groups where people get together and just sit and write, and you just kind of hold each other accountable to just show up to write. These kinds of things can be helpful because there are ways in which it focuses you on your writing. Sometimes you can take turns sharing what you're working on, discussing ideas, suggestions. In other words, helping craft an article as something for submission that is as strong as possible. So, yeah. Anyway, Henry, you want to keep going?
Sure. Yeah. Just to add in, we also know we're a global journal. And we know that we get many submissions. Our language is English. You know, if we had the funding, we could certainly try to do more than that, but that's been a limitation that we have. And we know that some people are coming in and submitting works as English as a second language writers and speakers. And we are sensitive to that. You know, we do try to be aware of that and try to be, you know, helpful in certain ways, knowing that those are the issues. But we also want to make sure you understand what a journal editor is and isn't. Way back before I went to grad school, I had a stint for a couple of years as a copy editor for a US government agency. And, you know, that was in a completely different role. I was an editor, but my primary job was helping people you know, sort of get the language right, get the meaning, you know, that they're trying to convey, you know, sort of accurately presented, and honestly to fix grammar and whatever else needed to be done. That's one kind of editor. That's not what journal editors are. We're not copy editors. That work is done by the journal authors. Sometimes peer reviewers will point out writing problems and actual mistakes, although usually that's in the context of a not particularly favorable review, when, you know, for the reasons that we've suggested before. What our job is very different. We're about trying to identify and support the development of really appropriate content for the journal. The writing side of it, we need to assume responsibility on the author's part to a large degree. And this means, you know, that we work with peer reviewers, for instance, to interpret their evaluations. It means we screen articles to make sure they fit the journal and things like that. So we're doing bigger picture things. We're not editors as in editorial assistants. And the reason is we're volunteers. With the number of articles we deal with, we would never have time, never have time to do that. We do, we try to help to the extent we can, but there's no practical way to do that. To go forward a little bit, just keep that in mind. As we talk, as Alex just mentioned, there's the ideas of peer groups and advisors and things like that, and they're probably the people who can help you with the writing issues. Okay. The final thing, okay, is to make sure that when you're submitting, it's not just the manuscript that you submit, and you don't just email it to us. We have a really nice system with University of Toronto Press that makes it very simple for you to submit, in the sense that everything's automated. You upload what you need to, but just make sure that you've got an abstract, you've got your contact information, and the copy of the article that you're uploading is free of identifying information. And that can be a little tricky. So if you are referencing yourself in a footnote, you could simply just put reference redacted or something like that. If you just take out your name and you leave the article, that especially in a field that could be pretty small, or a very small group of people doing research on your topic, that's a little bit of a giveaway. But you want to do that, and the reason for that is I think you get the best feedback when people aren't thinking, I hate to say it this way, aren't thinking about your feelings, aren't thinking about who you are one way or another. But what you really want, as hard as it is, and Alex and I have both received this in our own work, what you really want is objective, clear, and honest feedback on your work. And that's what we want from peer reviewers. So that, though, make sure you get the right stuff in there, and it helps us be much more efficient and use our time to support you in a revisions process and in other ways, rather than having to do some sort of administrative logistical work that could take hours and yet not be not get us anywhere with the journal. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so we're about 1:33. And so we want to leave enough time to answer questions. I've noticed on the chat that there have been a few questions posted. We will get to those in a few minutes. So next, Henry and I, a little more briefly, I think we want to go through what happens after submission to give you a sense of the process. And then we'll get to some of those kinds of questions that people have posted, or some others that you may well post. So you've put your work together. You've made sure that you've kind of fitted it for the journal you want to send it to. And so after submissions, what you have to understand is the first thing that happens is that once we receive submissions, as journal editors, we review the article, we read through it in order to decide whether or not to send it out for review. As Henry indicated, getting good reviewers can be difficult sometimes. It's a time commitment, and we're all very busy. And so we want to make sure that it is at a level where it's ready to be reviewed. And so if we read through it and we think it's good, we want to get others to weigh in on it. What we do is we begin a process of identifying and then soliciting experts for a blind peer review process. And that's a big part of the reason why we try to send them copies of the article without identifying names, whether it's in terms of, I forget the terminology, but when you look into the meta statistics of your paper, that sometimes your name is there, that kind of stuff. We try to scrub all of that out so that the reviewers are reading the article for its content and for its quality. It's not always possible. Sometimes, especially if you published a bit, people get familiar with the work you're doing and they may have a guess as to who wrote this, but it's supposed to be a blind process. We usually try to identify 2 to 3 individuals who have an expertise, who have a knowledge base in that area and can give us some good feedback on whether or not your article is ready for publication. Henry, you want to take over with the next piece?
I'm sorry, I'm just unmuting. Yeah, so once it goes out, we mentioned peer reviewers are identified. They agree to do the review. We send them a copy, and they do the review. Now, most journals have a specific set of questions that they ask reviewers or issues they want reviewers to give evaluations of. And we follow that as well, although we're flexible. You know, sometimes reviews are more narrative. Ultimately, they're gonna give us an evaluation along the lines I'll explain in a moment. But things that we are concerned with is what you're producing, what you've produced, a contribution to the field. This is sometimes the most complicated question because people could do really fine writing. There's no flaws. There's no, it's okay methodology wise and so forth, but it doesn't do much for the field. It doesn't advance the field. It could be a very, sort of simple project is, and this is sort of a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, such and such an event in history qualifies as genocide by the UN convention. And I'm going to tick off, I'm going to go through the UN convention and tick off why. Something like that doesn't really add to the field. Most people, those kinds of judgments can be made. They can be important in certain contexts, policy making and so forth. But for us, we need a little bit more. What about this case warrants its being a focus? What's unique about it? What do we learn from it, right? If it just fits the genocide convention definition, well, there's already plenty of research on how, those aspects of genocide that are included in the definition and so forth. So we're probably not going to get that much that's new. It's going to be descriptive of an event and not offer us further insight. So really make sure, that's one example, but really make sure what you're doing adds something to the field. And that also goes back to that literature review. Know what's come before. We've stressed it 6 times. We'll say it one more time, appropriate methodology, or maybe 2 times, appropriate methodology. Make sure you're using the right tools for the job you're trying to do. Appropriate theoretical framing, as we said before. And again, that can be you coming up with your own framework because what exists already doesn't fit the research you're doing. I love research like that. I love object or subject-driven research that drives changes in how we conceptualize things like genocide and the field that we're in and so forth. And again, knowledge of the literature. Reviewers are going to be asked to provide a recommendation to us, a straight decline. This will mean that given their expertise in the field, in the area of study, that even if the paper were revised, it would not be appropriate for publication in GSI. Usually that means that the methodology is flawed and the research would have to be redone. A straight accept with what we call, very minor revisions. There are always going to be revisions, and I really want to stress, don't get put off by that. An accept is an accept. If it says with revisions, do the revisions. That it's not a big deal. It's not any sign of failure or anything like that, which is what I thought when I was first submitting articles to journals. Oh my God, there are revisions. I really failed to do my job. No, those are gifts from reviewers to help you turn what you're writing into the best possible product it can be. So there are accept with very minor revisions and then accept with more significant revisions. So for instance, you might have done some really good, interesting new research. Your methodology is great, but you have not fitted into the field at all. So we don't know what's come before, how does this relate, who's going to want to use this material and so forth. So a reviewer might ask you to add a section addressing that kind of thing. And then there's also a revise and resubmit. This is where there's promise, the manuscript has promise, but the peer reviewers and we interpreting the peer reviews are not sure yet whether it's publishable or not. But it is possible that if it's rewritten, redone in a certain way, that it will be ready for, it would be worthy of publication. In the other 3 cases, nothing, in essence, there's already a decision. In that 4th case, what you're actually doing is we've gone through a peer review process, and we would go back through that process again, usually with the same reviewers, a second time. That's very, I would say on one hand, that's generous. We're going to take the time of the journal to actually review your work twice, which usually doesn't, or oftentimes doesn't happen because we think there's potential. But we're not sure yet, so we can't give a commitment to publish until we actually see you make good on what that potential is. I've already suggested the next point. We review the recommendations. We make a determination. Sometimes they're very clear, 2 big thumbs up from, 2 reviewers or all 3 reviewers, whatever it is, no problem. Sometimes we have splits and they're both very credible. Often that's where a revise and resubmit would come in. We make a determination based on the reviews, and then we communicate with you. And should I turn it, Alex? I'll turn it over to you for the encouragement part again.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the next thing I would suggest, don't be discouraged if your article is not accepted. There are a lot of reasons sometimes why articles are not accepted, and it's hard not to, but try not to take it personal. We invest a lot of time and energy and ourselves into the work we do, and we care about it, and it's hard not to let it hit you really hard. I remember when I was a new scholar, and a mentor of mine once told me that after he saw how devastated I was, he told me, if you're going to stay in this field, you need to develop a thicker skin. And he then went on to explain that this process is designed to create the greatest possible scholarship. These reviewers are looking to see weaknesses, flaws, shortcomings, so that when it's finally published, it is strong, it holds, it is something that genuinely contributes. And so, don't get discouraged. We've all been there. We have all had articles that don't get accepted. If that happens, read through the comments, see why it was rejected, to see if they're helpful, to see if they're correct. Reviewers don't always get it in terms of what we're trying to say. Sometimes it may be incorrect, or that you believe in what you are writing. So in other words, you don't necessarily have to always accept the critiques, but read them with an open mind, see if they do indeed help you. They are something to react to, so that you can say, oh, I really do need to change this, strengthen this, or that, nope, actually, but maybe I need to make my case a little more clear, or maybe be a little stronger in advocating for this particular theoretical perspective, whatever the case may be. It's also an opportunity for you to do more research, develop the piece until it's really ready for publication. And then at the end of that, find a more appropriate journal for your work. In other words, don't put it away and forget about it and think that it's no good. Realize that you'll be able to find a home, and that for many people, I know a lot of very well-published scholars who their articles that they published have gone through multiple reviews in other journals unsuccessfully before they find that one place that is a good fit, and where they have created what they wanted to say. Don't be discouraged by a revise and resubmit either. That, as Henry was saying, that's an indication that we see potential. We are investing developmental support and time, and think that you have a foundation there. You've got something good. It just needs some work. And if you do receive a revise and resubmit, make sure you read all of the comments carefully. Some of them, as I indicated, may be more useful than others. Some may be more accurate than others, but read them all, understand what they're suggesting, and really give them some thought, so that you can use your judgment on how to best address the concerns and suggestions. Do address all of the comments. If you disagree or don't want to make a change, give a compelling argument for this, right? I would encourage you, when you are resubmitting, in your resubmission, the email that you send with it, for example, um, go through, list out all the different things that you have done, how you have chosen to address them, or if you chose not to address a reviewer's comment, why you didn't, right? Why you thought that it was better not making that particular change. This helps us as editors when we get that resubmission. It helps us to first off see that you took it seriously. It kind of gives us a short, quick review of everything you've done. And there have been situations where Henry and I have seen that, read the article with those changes in mind, and have not sent it out for further review. We felt it was ready. And we do have that editorial ability to then put it into the pipeline for publication. Or if we feel like, okay, they've made the changes, but I do want to make sure that these reviewers have another chance to read it to see if it's what they were looking for, that is something that may happen as well. So a revise and resubmit is not a guarantee, but it is a real positive step forward. And it means that we are favorably disposed to your work and see it as likely that it can be published in our journal. So take the comments seriously, review them, and then when you send it back, make sure that you make the editor's job a bit easier, that you highlight all the changes that you have done, and with explanations to help us see all these different kind of things. All right.
If I could just add as well, a few things to keep in mind. When we give you a revise and resubmit, we want you to succeed. We want you to be able to do that. We want to be able to publish the article. And I know it's hard sometimes because we have the job of sending rejections and so forth, but we really are on your team, and your peer reviewers are too. Keep in mind that when something's internal to a journal, you have plenty of opportunities to revise, to fix, to address, to get it in great shape, as Alex was saying. Once it's published, it's out there. It's under your name, and it'll be there, we know now, forever. And so the difference between having something that's kind of mediocre that could have been great out there under your name and something that really is great because you took the time and you had the support to really work on it is really significant. People see that difference in the field, and how they take people in the field as scholars and practitioners seriously really depends on that. Also keep in mind, this is a time-consuming process. This is this is not something that happens overnight. We're volunteers. We're certainly not full-time editors. We would love to be. That would be a great job to have. And our peer reviewers are, as Alex has said, also volunteers in the field. And they're generally very gracious with their time. But it can take them, we're asking them, it can take them some time to get those peer reviews done. So be patient. We are on things. We have a really nice system set up, and we have automated reminders to peer reviewers and ourselves that make sure things keep moving along. But sometimes things will take a little bit of time. And the final thing is really respect the vision for your scholarship. We've been trying to stress that. I think what Alex said about the revise and resubmit is really important. You don't have to agree with every reviewer comment. If you have a good reason for why that comment doesn't really apply or isn't the right way to go, we want to hear that. We respect your way of thinking about things. Doesn't mean we'll automatically accept it, but it does mean that we take seriously your vision as well. And we really want to stress that. You're writing your scholarship. Don't try to conform. Find your voice, get that into the form that we're looking for, but that voice is yours, that content is yours, and really stay true to it. I guess that's about it. Alex, I don't know if you had any closing comments.
I would just highlight or concur with that last piece. In closing, this is your work. These are your ideas. This is the investment that you have created in terms of the scholarship, your contribution to knowledge. And while you are going through this process, getting input, getting feedback, always remember that this is a reflection of your vision, of these ideas that you believe are important and that you want to get out there. And the best work that I've ever come across is always where that person has stayed true to their vision to some extent, where they can take feedback and incorporate it, but at the same time, still speak in their own authentic voice as to these really important issues that we are all concerned with. And so hopefully, we have given you some ideas that you can think about, some concrete suggestions and some general ones as well. And I think with that, let's turn it over to Megan, who can maybe help field some questions and get some of that going for us.
Yes, definitely. Thank you both so much. You offered so many helpful tips, and we do have quite a few questions. So what I've done, I've gone through and kind of consolidated some of them. Some are kind of had some overlap. So why don't we start? We had a lot of questions about the pre-qualifications needed to either to submit a paper or to become a peer reviewer. Could you shed some light on what's needed, what background is needed for someone to submit?
A background, I guess I'm not,
I think they were asking, do they need to have like a minimum MA degree? Do they need to have a certain level
I
of
see.
qualifications?
Generally speaking, that's not an official prerequisite. We sometimes get articles from people who I guess we would identify as independent scholars, right? People who are not affiliated with an institution or so forth. We're not as concerned about the credentials as we are about the quality of the scholarship and the writing, and that we don't treat submissions differently depending on whether or not a person has a terminal degree or not.
Yeah, in fact, that is invisible to us, to be perfectly honest, and certainly invisible to the peer reviewers. And so there's no reason not to submit if you're a graduate student or practitioner in the field, anything like that. We welcome the submissions. If that's good work, we certainly want to be an avenue for publishing it. And at the same time, the thing to keep in mind is having a certain level, not credential, but experience also helps you, see the sort of depth at which you need to be writing, understand how to do, what the literature is, how to do how to set up your methodology in a way that really is sophisticated. So there is something to be said for experience, but if you're doing that, you're capable of that, we want to see your article. And the other thing I want to be very careful, we've given you some don'ts, maybe some do's, but also some don'ts. It may sound a little overwhelming. That's not what we want to convey. This is not a case where you can't do it. Everybody on this call can do it. Not a question at all. What we're hoping to convey is that here's how to do it. That's really what we want to show you how to do, because we know you all have that potential. Please don't be discouraged. Please don't feel like this is a mountain you can never climb. It's not like that. Once you sort of go through this, and maybe the first time, a couple times it happened to me, you get rejected, you figure it out. And after that, you know what to do, you know how to write articles, you'll be fine. But do not be discouraged, and also do not think you shouldn't submit, just because you feel like you're not capable of it. Really give it a shot and see how things go.
Right. Yeah, essentially, what we've hopefully not only explained the process, but given you some ideas so that a little bit of prep will basically strengthen your chances of getting a successful publication at some point. And that's all we're really trying to do, to give you some ideas about things you can do beforehand that will really benefit you during that process.
That's great. Thank you. We also had a few questions about page limit and word limit for a standard paper submitted to an academic journal. Do you have any insight into this?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Most journals have a page limit, and there can be some flexibility, but not that much. You generally want to try to stay within that limit for the journal you're thinking of submitting it to. Um, much of that is actually set by the constraints of the press that the journal is working with. Now, I'm not sure that's as much of an issue with journals that are only published online, right? Which has become an increasingly popular option where there are no print copies of it. Some of those kind of costs that publishers have is not necessarily as relevant there. But generally speaking, most journals have a page limit, and you want to stay somewhat close to that.
And to keep in mind, with our journal, we publish twice a year at this point. There's been some talk of going to 3 times a year, but I think Alex and I will just be drooling on ourselves if we try to do anything more right now. And we have 146 pages of the journal per issue. That doesn't mean a lot, but you'd have to look at our pages and calculate. I think it's something like 500 words, and we have it all worked out, sort of what that means in terms of words. We have a scale. But what I would say is this is also part of knowing the journal that you're submitting to. Very rarely in GSI do we have long articles, but also we generally have substantial articles. So it's rare to be under 10 pages unless it's a special issue with a lot of short articles or something like that. We also have a feature called Notes from the Field. And if you remember before I was saying, and Alex was saying, make sure you have analysis in your article, make sure it's complete, make sure you've done all this work. Notes from the Field actually started where we had practitioners in the middle of genocidal situations or proto-genocidal situations who were providing, sort of firsthand primary information about what was going on that we were able to publish, or people who are directly involved. For instance, Karol Kovanda, the Czech representative on the Security Council during the Rwanda genocide, published his account of what happened, what the deliberations were, and so forth in there. Those kinds of things are alternatives that we certainly embrace, sort of the beginnings of a research project or the first phase, where you'd like to share what you're doing with other scholars, maybe connect with other scholars over it. So that's fine as well. But I would say if I had to give a rough number, our max is somewhere around 12,000. It doesn't mean we wouldn't go over that, but that's a typical kind of, once we're over 12,000, we need a really good reason for going longer. And I would say if you're under, certainly if you're under 5,000, then we'd probably have some questions unless there were a particular reason to be that short. But generally, I would say 8 to 12 is typical.
A typical journal article is somewhere around 25 to 35 pages, depending. Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that helps.
Yes, thank you. There was another one as well, when you were speaking about doing your research on what journals to submit to. Someone is asking if you have any tips for researching these journals. I wonder if there's a central database or somewhere they can go to look into this.
Yeah, some of it comes from experience. You learn the field, right? But if you're just starting out, you may not be that familiar with what's out there. What I remember doing that seems to work, if you're reading other people's work as you're building your literature review and you're seeing journals consistently come up publishing in that kind of area that you're trying to write about, that's a good place to start. You can go online these days also and find, pretty much every journal that's out there. It just takes some time hunting and pecking. But the place that people often start is by looking at the work they're relying to do their literature review, and then using that as a starting point, finding out where those articles came from, what journals they used, so forth. Yeah.
I would just add that even following that up, if there are books that are relatively recent that are really big influences for you, look at the journals that are cited in those books. Those are going to be key. I have to say, I loved my dissertation director, great guy, great dissertation director, except he was a little out of touch with my field by the time I was finishing. And he suggested journals that really weren't the right fit for me. And I had to kind of learn on my own through sort of years of my own work, really where I should end up. And so, you know, again, unfortunately, it does take some time. There's no easy thing to do, but I think Alex is exactly right. Publish where you read is the simplest thing to say.
The other thing I would suggest is there used to be these things called conferences where you actually went there in person, and they would have these book exhibits. Very often, those professional associations, they have journals affiliated with them, and they very often have stands for different journals. So if we ever are back in that situation where we are going to conferences, check out those book exhibits, because very often you will find that they also carry the journals in, you know, that relate to the kind of work you're doing. So that's another opportunity for you to kind of build your knowledge base. It's also a good opportunity to speak to people who work for those presses to get a feel for what they're looking for, that kind of stuff.
And one of the benefits of conferences, I think this is a lot harder with COVID conferences, is that you may, when you're presenting, and this has happened to me, I'm sure it's happened to you know, Alex and others, after you give a talk and you might be on your game, a journal editor will come up to you and say, hey, or somebody who's editing a book, hey, I like that. That was really interesting. Can you, not that my work is really interesting, but you get the idea, they were being charitable. But hey, you should think about submitting for our journal. I've done this at conferences quite a bit with GSI and GSP, and it's really, it really is helpful. Doesn't mean you'll get published, doesn't mean, you know, it's not a commitment to publish, but it gives you a sense of what a journal finds interesting, that, hey, I'm interesting to this journal, and that's a journal you're going to want to keep in mind as you go forward, because that's going to be a place you're going to want to think about publishing. So I think that's helpful as well. I just want to give a shout out to Joyce Apsell, who put a comment in the complimenting us. Wonderful, amazing scholar of genocide education and so forth at NYU, who was past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Really interesting thinker and very practically oriented activist as well. So Joyce, great to see you here, and thanks for showing up. I'm pretty sure you don't need any advice from us, but thanks for giving the moral support.
Hi, Joyce. So we do have another question. Is there a rule of thumb of how much a submission should be dedicated to the literature review? And is there a point where this overview or background information becomes too in-depth for a paper?
Yes, there could potentially.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
You know, the thing is, and this is where there's an art to writing good articles. Well, you know, there are general formats or styles and so forth. At the end of the day, there's no one way to present the work that you're doing. And so, you know, you really have to feel your way in terms of making sure that your literature review is complete, that you have touched upon everything that you should, but you don't want, you know, you don't want a 30-page article where 25 pages are the literature review, and then you have very little devoted to the research and the analysis and conclusion, so forth. So, you know, use your judgment, get other people to review what you're doing, you know, before you submit it. Read other articles, get a feel for how much time they devote to the literature review. You know, again, there's no one way to do it. Get as much information as possible, and then use your best judgment, and you learn. You know, you submit something and you get feedback, and, you know, hopefully it's a positive outcome, or if it's not as positive, you can learn from that and then refine how you do it. Every article is different. Sometimes the literature review is more important or more relevant to the analysis, so you have to go into it in a little more detail. Other times, not so much.
I would just add, Alex, excellent comments. I would just add think of a lit review in a journal article as needing to be very efficient. You know, really almost give yourself a constraint and try to stick within that. It's very different from what you might do. And this is really hard. I know I had this exact experience when I started writing journal articles out of my dissertation. My dissertation, I had been immersed in the literature. That was, you know, I spent, you know, a chunk of my life learning, becoming an expert based on other people's work in an area. And that was all in my head as I came out of grad school and started, you know, trying to publish articles. You need to give yourself amnesia somehow. You need to forget all those details, even things that were just fascinating, you know, aspects of something that you're connecting to in your work. You know, debates that are really complicated, nuances of a work, criticisms that you had. Chances are that's too in-depth to worry about. When you're doing your lit review for a journal article, think of Edgar Allan Poe's concept of unity of effect. In a short story, every word has to contribute to the one effect you are going for. It's the same thing with a lit review. A lit review is only there to serve what you do later in the article, and everything that's in it needs to directly tie to whatever it is you're doing.
But keep your other stuff. Put them in a temporary file, put them aside. Who knows? In some other work, you may find a use for that material. Keep it, but it may not be relevant for that particular submission.
Thank you. We have a personal question for both of you as editors. With everyone having very busy working and personal schedules, how do you set aside time for writing and dedicating work for writing for journals? And if you have any tips to share.
Again, I hate to be that typical academic who doesn't give a straight answer. I think it depends. Everyone has to find out their own system. I find for me, I have to be ruthless. I've had to be much better about carving out time for my writing, because as we all know, academia is incredibly hectic and busy, and there are a lot of demands on your time. And if you don't structure time every day or twice a week or a certain set time, you'll never get to it, because there's always something else that's going to demand your time. So for me, I had to learn that I've got to be ruthless, and I have to set aside, build into my schedule time for the writing. And the second thing I will say is I also had to, I used to think I needed big chunks of time to write. And then we started having kids, and my regular responsibilities multiplied dramatically, and I never had big chunks of time. And instead, what I learned is that if I've got 20 minutes here or 30 minutes there, that's time I can use to make a little bit of progress, even if it's reviewing a piece that I've already written, even if it's just adding another sentence or two, even if it's just reading a little bit more. Those little pieces throughout a week add up. So that's what works for me. I know other people have different strategies.
Yeah, you should be aware. It's very complicated. I'm terrible at you know, saying no to people, you know, for different things that they ask me to do. And I'm also not the best at time management. I get involved with a project and I just, you know, spend more time there or whatever. And so you should be, rest assured, you don't have to be great at that. One thing that's really important, and this is lost in a lot of academic sort of tenure track decision making and so forth. Quality is infinitely more important than quantity. Even though the way often, you know, professors, for instance, going up for tenure get evaluated, focuses on quantity above a certain threshold of quality. For me, it's much more important to have, you know, some influential, thoughtful, innovative, really good publications out there, a few of those, than thousands of pages of added curlicues that people sort of skim through because there's not really much there and it's saying the same thing other people have said. So if you don't have a lot of time, you can still be really successful. It can focus you on spending the time on the ideas that are really, really worth developing and being efficient in developing them. I would say that. I would also say if anybody has any suggestions, please let me know, because I'm still trying to figure it out.
Right.
I am desperately trying. I have had plans. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Probably why Alex has a lot more books published than I do. I think he's much more self-disciplined. But,
no, we all struggle. This is an issue we all struggle
yeah.
with, managing your time and so forth. And the trick is figuring out what works for you, what time of day you're able to set aside. I find I'm more productive in the mornings, when things are fresh, at least intellectually. But just, keep experimenting until you figure out the system that works for you.
And even play psychological games with yourself. You might be the kind of person that if you're too close to a deadline, you start to get tense and your thinking sort of narrows and you're not able to do a good job. What does that mean? Tell yourself my real deadline is always 2 weeks before the actual deadline, because I know I won't be a good when I'm too close to the deadline. I'm kind of the opposite. I try to do stuff ahead of deadlines, and I'm not stressed enough to get my thinking going. When that deadline starts approaching, I start feeling like, okay, I really got to do this. I gotta stop thinking endless different angles, and so I got to cut this down. I got to focus, and that's helpful for me. So it really depends on your own psychology. There are other ways you can do it. Some people like to write in chunks, right? So I tend to like to write for a day. If I try to do a half hour, like Alex was saying, every day for 2 weeks, I lose my focus. I can't do it. So figure out what the process that works with your kind of thinking, your kind of writing, your kind of lifestyle, and then just sort of work within that. Don't try to fight yourself, thinking that there's an ideal way. If I could just work for 1 hour every day, for 2 months, I'll have a book published. And that's not the way you do it. You'll just get upset at yourself and actually not be that productive, because it's not the way you think, and it's not the circumstances under which you do your best work.
One last point, if I may, pick something to write about that you care about. I know people who publish just to get them out, and the reality is you want tenure if you're working at a university and all these different kind of things. But what keeps me motivated to make the time is that I write about topics I truly care about that I think are important. And I get excited about the work I'm doing. If that's how you approach it, you'll make the time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, very much agreed.
I
did see one question from a colleague of mine from Worcester State, which Lawrence Roberge was asking. Some publications ask for publication fees. And when you say any thoughts about that, I will just say we do not. And as a matter of principle, that's something we don't want to do. There are different reasons that happens. One reason is the cost of publication. This particularly happens where the publishing process itself it goes beyond text a lot. For instance, it might be in an art history journal or a science journal that needs complicated figures, that kind of thing. There might be a cost associated with publishing that somewhat gets passed on to the author. But the other thing, and this is a growing problem, the other thing is predatory journals. And this is, if someone's asking you to pay to publish, you want to be super careful. Oftentimes, the value of that publication will not be significant. It's not going to be a recognized publication. And you have no idea what it's going to mean to be published. It doesn't mean that's always the case, but really investigate to find out. Ask colleagues, ask peers in your field, whether it's a legitimate journal. And there are actually good websites devoted to predatory journals and predatory conferences. There's one guy and his daughter, I think, are located in Turkey, who have this organization, and they put on like thousands of conferences a year. And what they do is they look for every conference announcement they can find, and then they do a conference on the same topic in the same city like a month before. And they are often real conferences, but it's horrible accommodations. There's no value, no serious scholars are going to it, and they charge money for it. And you have to be super careful about this. Really always confirm it's a legitimate thing. If it's not in your library, that's the first thing to look for, and you know, really check that out, because it's very cynical. I mean, it's like anything else on the internet
And
now.
you
There's
have to be
cynical
careful.
people. Yeah.
And I would simply add to what Henry's saying, I couldn't agree more, that for those who are working towards tenure, that there are a lot of universities and departments in particular that do not count those kind of publications that you paid towards your tenure file. So there can be legitimate fees, as Henry was pointing out, but you have to be really, really careful. Make sure that it is reputable, make sure that it's not one of these predatory, you know, pay to play kind of publications.
Yeah.
If you can stay away from them, generally do so.
Yeah, and a great indicator is if it's a known university press. That's why we're excited about the longtime connection with University of Toronto. If it's especially a public, state, a major research university that's public in a state, those are always really good. University of Nebraska or whatever it is in the States. Those are, that's going to be a legitimate journal. And so those are good indicators. And then the big companies that also, there are Brill, Taylor and Francis, Palgrave. There are a number of Springer that have journals. Those are all established journals, or typically established journals. So if you know the publisher, it's a credible, serious academic publisher, then you're in good shape. But even to the point of being careful, people mimic things. I mean, we used to joke, and there aren't a lot of jokes you can tell in genocide studies for obvious reasons. But we were joking a little bit like an old Monty Python movie. And I'm not sure if Alex, if you were on the team at this point, we were talking about, well, what should the name of Genocide Studies International be? And we were kicking, the International Journal of Genocide Studies. And, we went through all these different iterations. Predatory journals use those permutations of names to create very similar sounding journals to serious, credible journals. And if you're not careful, you might not catch that. And they also actually, and we've discovered this, they also will list people on their editorial board who are credible scholars who have no idea, have no connection to the journal, because they don't care. So just be aware of that as well.
That's really helpful. We had a few questions about the peer review process, a few about credentials to become a peer reviewer, and what is involved in the peer review process.
So there is no one way to become a peer reviewer. Generally speaking, when Henry and I are looking to get a review for an article, we try to rely first and foremost on our familiarity with the field. Mm-hmm. And but there are sometimes articles that are beyond our expertise or our connections. And in that case, we check with people we know. We sometimes do our own homework by looking to see who is doing research in this area, to try to find people who can give an informed review of that that particular article. Generally, if you want to become a reviewer, you can. There's no one way to do it. It's not like something you apply for. The more you write, the more you publish in an area, the more people will think about you in regards to a particular issue, topic, so forth. Sometimes affiliation with professional organizations or conference presentations, those are things that get your name out there, that makes it more likely you could be called upon. But it is always, I think, one of those struggles, finding people to provide good reviews for your articles and who have the time. We get rejected a lot from people who are just too busy. They're in the middle of other things, and they just don't have the time to provide the time it takes. Henry, that.
No, we're open. I mean, it's a little bit tricky with peer review because similar to book reviews, when we review a book, it has to be us reaching out to do the review, not someone saying, I just published this book, can you review it? And the reason for that is we need to be disinterested in how those selections are made, right? It doesn't mean somebody who wants to do that, we wouldn't review their book. We get books from publishers and so forth. It's a similar thing with peer reviewers. While, if you let us know, hey, I'm an expert on this or whatever, that might be helpful to us. The issue will be that we should be sort of looking at the field and picking people from a sort of disinterested perspective. Hey, I saw this person present at a conference, knows this subject area. I write a note. If we have anything in this area, I'm gonna that would be a great peer reviewer, or something like that. Typically, it's just because we're reading in the field. Occasionally, it will be through our someone can't do a peer review for us, but they'll suggest someone else, and quite often that will be a more of an emerging scholar, right? So somebody had worked, somebody did a dissertation with a senior scholar 2 years ago in an area. Senior scholar can't do it, but says, hey, this person did a great dissertation. They'd be perfect as a peer reviewer. That would be something that would open the door.
Yeah.
That's great. Someone else is asking if it makes a difference in the peer review process whether or not a research project has been funded or not.
No, you reveal all your funding, but unless it's a politically objectionable organ, like the White Supremacy League of the United States or something, something like that, or the Institute for Historical Review relative to Holocaust denial, the Turkish Coalition of America, something like that, where it's obviously, somebody's got an agenda and trying to get something published. Those kinds of dubious organizations, okay, that's one thing. But if you're getting legitimate research funding, government funding through a program where you're not, obviously doing government work, university funding, private foundation funding, that's great. That's perfectly fine. Usually the condition is if you publish, you need to acknowledge them, and we're fine with doing that. The research for this article was done through a grant from the Lindsay Foundation or whatever it is. That's perfectly fine.
Given the nature of the work that we're doing, it's a very politicized field, right? And we're all familiar with the issues of genocide denial and these kind of things. We do try to be very in tune and aware of those kind of things. But if it's, as Henry was saying, research funding from a university, from a government, and the scholarship is sound, therefore, there's no issue, and that's not something even that the reviewers address at all.
Yeah, and I would add, if you do research as part of, say, a government project or a UN project or something like that, and you're allowed to take your piece of that and publish it, that's perfectly fine. We're not considering things tainted. Again, that's the beauty of the peer review process, as hard as it can be, is it's really testing for all that kind of stuff, setting aside all the information about the article. Is there a bias in this article? If something is obvious, then that's something a peer reviewer is going to flag. But if this is good research, and it's funded, without any questions about where it's coming from, that's not a problem at all. And I always want to suggest, like with peer review, it's like a benefit. I know it's hard, especially if you get rejected, but you can even think of rejections as someone would have raised these issues when the article was published outside and trashed you in some, disciplinal context, or a paper they did at a conference or something. Much better to sort that all out before, get the tough feedback up front, and really, benefit from that peer review process, and treat it as somebody who's maybe a tough coach, but a coach nonetheless, not an enemy.
It's for your benefit, right?
Yeah.
It's protecting you in the
long
protection.
Run. Yeah, it's your insurance policy that what goes out, if it passed peer review, that's a good thing. And you can trust that even if people criticize you, it's as much about them as it is about what you did. Yeah, people will disagree with you, but the quality of your scholarship is assured. And because it's gone in a peer-reviewed journal, people have to take it seriously because experts in the field have said you need to take this seriously whether you agree with it or not. And that credibility is important.
Thank you. And maybe the last question for today. This person said in some social science research projects, innovative data collection methods are becoming more available. They give examples incorporating art in qualitative methods or using apps for data collection. They're not in line with traditional qualitative or quantitative methods. And do journals tend to be more critical of these new methods as they're used less often, or if they're new?
I'm not sure how Henry's going to respond to this. My feeling is I think we welcome innovative work.
I agree.
We don't want, with genocide studies in particular, we don't want it to be solely historical work, just looking at the past kinds of cases. We want it to move our knowledge forward. And there are a lot of exciting developments in terms of how people can gather information, how they structure it, the kind of methodologies that are out there. So I would suggest with our journal, we are open to that. Now, there are some journals that I would suggest that tend to be more conservative in that area, that may not be as open to innovative kinds of projects. Part of the issue as well is that when we send it out to reviewers, we are trying to find people who will read it and give it a fair evaluation. And it may well be that someone has a hard time with something that's innovative, right? Maybe they can find reasons for it and they'll make that point. But that's why we send it out to multiple reviewers, and that's why the editors read it as well, so that collectively any one particular voice doesn't necessarily overwhelm others unless it is valid, right? Unless it's making a point that we think, okay, actually that's, there's no way to get around this issue or that kind of problem. But in general, I would suggest, as long as it's well written, well argued, that the methodology is presented and defended in terms of, what you're doing. I think that's great for our field. It's great for, what we can learn from the work you're doing.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say an innovative data collection approach is welcome, because part of what happens with that is not only is the specific content that you're presenting important for the field, but you're potentially giving other scholars new tools to do the research they're doing. And for us, that's very exciting. That's really, the mission of Genocide Studies International is really to do that for the field, to move the field as a whole forward. And so we would embrace that. I would just say, yeah, going along with Alex said about explaining it and defending it, just make sure if your methodology fits what you're trying to do and it's or it's the only way to get at a topic or whatever it is, you make that clear. That's what we want. If you're using a quantitative methodology for something that just sort of flat data won't give us insight into, and we need sort of individual insight into, we need some qualitative features, then that's not going to work. That it doesn't matter how you do that, it's not going to be the right fit for the topic that you're doing. But as long as it's the right fit and you explain it and show what you're doing, I think it's great to have innovative approaches. I'm really excited, and that's where one of the things two things you got to remember. One is we're just like you, just typically older than a lot of you because you're skewing towards earlier career. How you are coming out of your graduate program is how we were coming out of ours. It's all the same stuff. There's no Wizard of Oz behind all this stuff. There's no mystery. Peer reviewers are just other scholars. They're people we think they are good scholars. They are respected scholars. They're scholars we trust to be careful and objective. They're scholars whose work is cited, who other scholars think are good. But they're other scholars just like you. We're just like you. And one of the great things about editing a journal is how much I learn in new areas. How much new, I don't know much about this particular case and I learn about it. Here's some new trend. We just, might have an article in criminology or something, which is Alex's specialty, not my area. But by going through that initial screening, I get to learn more. By reading the peer reviewers' comments, I get to learn a lot more in that area. And it's really exciting. So innovate. It's great. We want to see that. We will learn from you, and be excited to do that.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for this very informative session. If you've missed any part of this workshop, we have recorded it, and we will be sending the link to the participants, but we'll also be sharing it on our website, so you can go back to it and listen to what was spoken about today. We'll also be updating the frequently asked questions section of our Genocide Studies International webpage with some of the questions that you've been bringing up. So I've recorded those. So if you, again, need to refer back to that, they will be there. So if you would like any more information on the Institute, I believe my colleague Jenna has shared the link to our website, but you're also welcome to email me at admin@genocidestudies.org. And thank you so much for your participation today, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Please stay safe.
Yeah, thank you all, and hopefully this was useful. Again, it's just the two of us based on what we've done. Again, nothing magical about it, and you might get different opinions from other editors. But hopefully this will give you some tools, a little bit of comfort maybe, and confidence in doing what you're doing, and some insights into how it all works.
Right. Get out there and write.
Sounds good. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.